Hi, and thank you for tuning in to this e-learning resource on a counter-fraud framework, which has been specifically created for Charity Fraud Awareness Week 2018. I'm Mark Bainham, and I'm the Head of Counter-Fraud for Plan International. Now, hopefully you will have just heard the e-learning resource on due diligence and partnership working by my colleague Nick Blake from the Big Lottery Fund, and that's certainly one part of the sort of control mechanisms that a charity needs to have in place to reduce the risk of fraud. But it's certainly not the whole story. And to put in place a robust defense against the risks, I would recommend very strongly something that I would call a counter-fraud framework. This is something that has a number of different elements, none of which are the single answer to fraud, but taken together can be seen as a good defense against the risk of fraud against a charity. And top of that list, I will put an anti-fraud and anti-corruption policy. Now, there are many examples that you can have a look at to see what would suit your organization, but it has to very much set the tone at the top, and it has to have the endorsement and the championing of somebody at a high level in your organization, preferably from the board or the chief executive or somebody in a similar position. And it also needs to set out not just the principles of, in our case, we call it zero tolerance to fraud and corruption, but also the responsibilities of staff and responsibilities at management level, but also at everybody's level. So something there, and there are many examples to have a look at. But a policy by itself is just essentially words on paper unless it's got something to back it up. So together with that, you need a good control framework. And there are many parts of that control framework to ensure financial probity, to look at, for example, risks around, or to counter risks around procurement, so having fair tendering processes and open and transparent processes in that area, other areas around segregation of duties, and then something around perhaps fair recruitment policies and practices. But even if you have the best control framework in the world, you're likely to experience fraud at some stage in the organization. So you then need to know about it. You have to have a mechanism that allows you to know through a reporting and recording mechanism. Now, most organizations should be able to set up something internally to make it fairly simple for staff to report suspicions or concerns. But I would also recommend, as an addition to that, setting up a whistleblower line. That can be something done internally, or in many cases you can outsource that. And I would probably recommend outsourcing on the basis that this probably gives a bit more independence, and it allows staff to sort of feel more comfortable if they're not prepared to go through the normal reporting procedure that you may have in place. But once you know that something has happened, you've also got to have a response plan. So who's going to do what? If an investigation is required, who's responsible for doing that? Do you have the resource in your own organization, or would you seek to outsource that to another organization to come in and help you? Should it be under internal audit? Is it under finance? There are pros and cons in putting it in different places in the organization, but the prime message here is that before it happens, you have to know who it is who is responsible for doing what. The next point in this counter-fraud framework is identifying your risks. So a good analysis of your fraud exposure, your fraud risks, looking at the various operational areas that you work in, what can be higher risk of fraud. I mean, if you work abroad in some difficult countries, that might be a fraud risk. Or if you had risks around fundraising, you have a lot of members of the public you bring into fundraise, that brings its own risks, as you're probably aware. So looking at your risks gives you a greater chance of actually being able to tackle them at source and putting in the appropriate controls to stop it happening in the first place where possible. The other point is you've got to let your staff know. So fraud prevention and awareness training for all your staff at all levels is very much a key part of this. And there are many training resources available that can help you. Another thing to think about is you're not on your own. In the charity sector, we all suffer from fraud at some stage or another, and we have good practice and we have lessons to learn. And so I'd recommend sharing with each other, joining some of the forums that exist, some of the existing networking opportunities that arise. And if you haven't got one in your particular area, think about setting one up. And finally, I'd like to say that we need to be accountable. So in terms of reporting what is going on in terms of possible fraud risks or fraud occurrences, you need to report that to your board. But also, I would suggest that you can be open about that and you can be transparent. For example, in my organization, we actually publish our fraud cases on our website, and the reason for that is to not just say that we are the same risk of fraud as other organizations, but it gives you a chance to show what you're doing about it. And if people see that you're addressing a risk and you're taking a robust action in response, they will react better. Now, I think that's pretty much coming to the end of this short webinar, but I would like to just point out that we have a lot of free resources available. So please don't forget to check these out. They're available as part of Charity Fraud Awareness Week, and includes our brand new help sheet on grant fraud, which has been released today. You can find these resources on the Fraud Advisory Panel website or by following #CharityFraudOut on Twitter. Thanks very much for listening.